Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here, and today I am super stoked to be checking out Ceriatone's latest stomp box creation, the Horsebreaker. Before I get started, I of course owe a huge thanks to Ceriatone's Nick and Lynn for sending me one of these bad boys to demo. I've been looking forward to this pedal's release for, well, since the beginning of this year, roughly, when they announced this thing. And I gotta say, it lived up to expectations and then some for what this product does. As always, I don't accept financial compensation for reviews or demo services, so you will be getting some unfiltered opinions from me about this. Fortunately for them, in typical Ceriatone fashion, this is a very high quality, great sounding product for the right player. I simply cannot, recommend everyone and their brother go out and buy one of these. And I still ultimately recommend digital modeling for a lot of people that watch this channel. But if you have, say, a clean American amp or just a pedal platform kind of rig, and you're looking for some of the mid-heavy vintage British inspired tones that this can deliver, then this is one hell of a pedal to do that, and it's one that you should definitely keep an eye on, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll know whether or not to pull the trigger on it. So, the Horsebreaker, what the hell is it? Well, this actually contains two separate pedal circuits under one enclosure. And it's kind of hard to say which side is more iconic than the other, but I can definitely tell you which original is going to run you the higher price tag. Starting with the horse side, this is the Ceriatone Centura circuit, which in and of itself is based on the Klon Centaur. And the Centura has quite the good reputation in terms of build quality, component quality, authenticity compared to the original, and it runs a fraction the price of the real deal while still kind of feeling like it. So if you're looking for a, kind of similarly built real Klon, then, they have a pretty good reputation. The other side though, the breaker is based on the early 90s Marshall Blues Breaker pedal, not to be confused with the later 4-knob BB+2, not the same design, but the original Blues Breaker in and of itself is trying to capture the Blues Breaker combo amp tone heard from the Marshall combos that Eric Clapton was playing around the time of the similarly named John Mayall and the Blues Breakers record. It's a long-winded way of saying this is supposed to sound like a lower gain Marshall in a box kind of deal. So, if you're running an American style clean amplifier, then you might put one of these up front to either boost it into a channel 2 of sorts, or maybe even have it as an always on kind of thing for some top end grit. Now that's pretty cool, in and of itself, just having those two circuits, but the magic really comes together when you have them on at the same time, and there's some really cool stuff that you can do with that. So let's get a quick physical rundown out of the way. First things first though, the packaging for this is brilliant, absolutely gorgeous. It's understated and minimalist. You feel like you're gonna open up like a high quality watch or something like that. Really cool, I dig that. But the pedal itself, you've got a single input and output standard 9-volt DC adapter there. You've got foot switches for each side. The kind of original controls, so the horse side has gain, output, and treble, and the breaker side has volume, gain, and tone. The cool parts though here that you wouldn't see on any old pedal like this, not that there's really any I can name, is the fact that you can switch between both buffered and true bypass modes. And I tend to agree with the original Klon creator that buffered is almost always better, especially for the kind of buffer this uses. It is extremely high quality in terms of design and components. So I would definitely recommend using it if you don't have something like a weird impedance sensitive pedal after this. I wouldn't recommend that in a signal chain anyway. But 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 times out of 100, the buffer is going to do just perfectly. And the cool thing about this is it does add a decibel or two or boost. You might not notice it until you switch it to true bypass, but it's something that I kind of prefer to have on. It sounds fuller when you turn it off. So it's going to come down to preference in your setup, but no matter what kind of pedal board you're running, you'll find a setting that works for you. The real magic, though, is this little toggle switch. While the pedal's named Horse Breaker, you could technically make this a breaker horse because you get to choose which one of these circuits comes first in your signal chain. So you can boost the breaker side with the Centaur side or vice versa. And there's very different tones you can achieve by doing something as simple as just flipping the toggle switch. And I actually kind of planned to show a quick demo of like, oh, look at the different sound you get when you do that. The fact of the matter is, it really doesn't sound good that way. When you dial it in for, say, the horse boosting breaker sound, you're almost guaranteed to not get a great tone if you do the breaker through the horse. And so you'll see my settings change quite drastically depending on which way I go. And I definitely have a preference. I'm going to show you different ways of going about it. But it's a really cool inclusion that you get to do that, because this adds a whole new level of dimensionality to this pedal. And it's something that you otherwise couldn't do in a fixed pedal board setup unless you had like a looper or loop switcher that you could somehow switch the positions on its own, which, you know, if you have something like that, it's going to cost you a pretty penny. So the fact they're able to shove all of this into here for 250 bucks, the cost of the Centura alone, and not really skimp out anywhere besides maybe a more simplified enclosure, that's pretty damn impressive. With any specialized design like this, though, you're going to have to make some compromises, and there are plenty of things this pedal does not do that may be a deal breaker for some people out there. So first things first, there are individual foot switches, like I said, for each side of the pedal, which means that without external gear, you cannot turn off both at the same time with a single foot switch. I mean, you could like go at it from an angle and do one of those. But if you want to treat this as a single drive pedal, then you might want to put this in one of those aforementioned loop switchers. But then that would kind of defeat the ability to use one of these as like a preamp sound and then a lead boost. So it's ultimately going to come down to how you use it. But be aware that if you want to turn both on and off at the same time, you're going to get a little creative. Similarly, there is no effects loop in the sense that you can't place anything between these two sides of the pedal. To me, that's not a deal breaker whatsoever, because I really can't think of a single pedal I would want between these two tones. They're kind of perfect in terms of where they fall in gain structure, no matter which way that you use it. If I had something like a clean boost or a tube screamer or a treble booster, I would want it before this pedal. Anything higher gain, whether it be fuzz, full-blown distortion, maybe another transparent overdrive, I would want it after it. So again, I really have no complaints there. And if you absolutely have to put a pedal between these two tones for whatever reason, then just buy another blues breaker and clone derivative. Clone, that is. And the last thing you can't do is run these two drive sounds in parallel, which on paper at least is a really cool idea. I do like a lot of parallel drive sounds, and the premise of not having outboard gear to do so is pretty nice, but I don't really miss it because, first of all, there's kind of a sweet spot range where both of these circuits can sound really similar, which would kind of defeat the purpose of running parallel drives. And then on the other hand, there's plenty of range where they sound so far apart that it would sound kind of weird and just not all that impressive running them in parallel. So on top of all the other design decisions they made here, like the switchable order and the buffer switch here, I imagine it would have been extremely expensive or flat out impossible to implement something like that in this form factor at this cost. So I don't really miss it. The only thing I would have kind of liked to see is the ability to turn on and off both at the same time without losing this functionality, which again, probably super complex. So what we get, I'm very happy with. It just limits the ways that I could foresee myself using that. Like I mentioned earlier, the definitive sounds of this pedal don't happen until you engage both the horse and breaker side, in my opinion. But you know me, we're gonna have to talk about both of these in isolation for just a moment. I am going to have a more in-depth video on the Klon Centaur and the Marshall Blues Breaker later on this month, so if you're interested in that, do stay tuned for that. But for now, a couple of minutes for each, starting with the horsey. I'm not the biggest Klon fanatic, to say the least. I definitely appreciate the Klon. I've played a number of derivatives and demoed them and thought they were really cool. You know, I think even among the most snobby pedal collector, you know, they should have some kind of Klon pedal with their OCD and their favorite Tube Screamer or Blues Breaker, whatever drives they're using. It is that unique. It is a phenomenal design. There's some really great academic work that went on in that, as well as some just practical circuit knowledge. With that said, I definitely don't think it's worth $2,000 for an original. I think even some of the derivatives are charging a little much. And I personally wouldn't have paid the new price for one. It just doesn't have that much value to me. Though I certainly understand why Bill was charging that for parts and labor and all that. You know, not saying it's not worth it for some people. But the Klon is like the ideal dad rock sound, I guess some people would describe it as, like the boosted Marshall in a box kind of deal. But it does have a unique gain structure, and it isn't just that. So I think it is oversimplification. Some people swear by it as the ideal clean boost for anything from pushing a clean amp to the edge of breakup or just a little bit of natural tube overdrive crunch, or boosting an already high gain amp into full saturation. Other people say it's the ideal distortion pedal and you should absolutely ignore the clean boost side and use it strictly for gain. I kind of lie somewhere in between. For the actual clean amp parts, I definitely rely on the insane amount of output level this circuit offers. I forget how many dB it is, but it's nuts compared to most pedals that are like this. So I definitely like to turn this quite high, start getting into some natural tube glassy breakup sound, and then use the gain to kind of fill out the mids, because this does an interesting thing where it actually articulates some of those mid frequencies the more that you turn up the gain control, which is great because that's kind of what you want to happen anyway, to keep the bottom end from being so flubby and the high frequencies from being so spiky in your ears. So great design with that. And then the treble control is basically like a hi-fi shelf of sorts. I think it has a lot more cut than it does boost, but this can kind of be your fine tuning for how scratchy your amp is, or if you've got something that's really dark, then you can crank this up. So my general go-to settings are in those higher output and, you know, mid-gain to higher gain, depending on what I'm going on, if I'm trying to transform an amp like this into something that sounds more British. But then for high gain, I do something that isn't quite so orthodox, I think. A lot of people just be like, yeah, bro, full output, no gain, treble to taste. There's your clean boost. I think that misses a lot of the magic of the Klon. It'll work, and if you've already got a really mid-heavy filtered amp to begin with, then absolutely crank the shit out of it. But like I said, as you turn up gain, it does start to bring in a little more mid content. And so what I like to do is bring up gain until I get kind of the EQ profile I like, just a little bit of dirt, you know, like Tube Screamer kind of compression sounding, nothing that sounds like an extra preamp tube or anything. Bring output level up, which does not take much most of the time. And then again, treble to taste. If you want a glassier sound, turn it up. So a lot of the times my, you know, boosted amp tones will look something like that. So that's kind of how I would use a Klon. They're pretty cool. While the Censura circuit may be able to trace its lineage to a piece of gear with quite the flamboyant reputation, the understated side of the Bluesbreaker is equally as interesting to me, because this is one of those, I guess what people would call a transparent drive. And it's not in the same way that I would use the word transparent, you know, like an EQ pedal or clean boost. That's transparent to me because it's not clipping your signal, it's not adding any distortion or compression or fundamentally changing what's going on with your guitar. You know, the EQ, you're cutting a few frequencies, boosting here and there, and it's still more or less the same kind of signal. Yes, it's been manipulated, but that's kind of what I think of when I think of that word. This, on the other hand, you can definitely get plenty of distortion if you dial up the gain, but there's kind of a sweet spot up until around noon or so where there's some grit, there's some top-end dirt going on, but it doesn't really sound like you're adding distortion. It's just kind of a bigger, fuller thing. It's kind of hard to describe unless you hear it, and that is exactly why so many players use this as like an always-on kind of sound. Even if you ignore all the other cool use cases for the Bluesbreaker circuit, that alone tells me it's succeeding, right? Because this is ultimately trying to sound like a low wattage Marshall amp. So the fact that you would combine this with another amp to achieve those tones is an always on thing, you know, I would say mission accomplished there. But if you turn up the gain, and especially the output level, since this doesn't have nearly as much headroom as this does, then yeah, you can start approaching those lower end mid-gain plexi sounds. And it definitely takes boost well. It even takes post boost well, which is something we'll get into in a moment. The tone control is not nearly as sensitive as something like a Tube Screamer. You're not going to get a cocked wah sound out of it. You're barely even going to get much roll off on the low and high end, but it is enough to kind of shape your guitar. And that's why I would say this is a subtle boost, and it's one that in very specific use cases can make sense if you want something that's not entirely clean, but not entirely dirty. With that said, when it comes to kind of modern voiced high gain amplifiers, I'm not crazy about this. If you have something that has, say, pre-filter controls, like the Fortin Girth Grind stuff or something similar like a Mesa Boogie Mark series, then you could absolutely use this as kind of your just overall transparent boost with just a little bit of dirt. But we're talking 5150s, dual rectifiers, and not really crazy about it. It's just, it's too flat. It's kind of even scooped sounding a little bit, no matter where you have the tone control. And I don't think it has enough clean output volume to make a significant dent in really saturating your gain. So not crazy about it. I did have an MXR Il Diavolo for a while that I quite liked for high gain applications. It was kind of based on the blues driver and stuff like that, but it was modified and kind of for a more high gain sound. I wasn't using it much, so eventually I flipped it. But you can definitely hear the lineage, you can definitely hear the legacy of this kind of circuit in that. But for me, this is more of a mid gain and below kind of sound, which actually is exactly what I've been missing in my pedal collection, because I kind of set up my OCD a little higher and, other symmetrical clipping diode pedals a little lower, and this fits right between it, which is epic. So let's talk about the juicy bits. Using both of these circuits at the same time, and we'll start with the C through BB setting, the Centura through Bluesbreaker. And this is admittedly my favorite setting, which is kind of odd for me until I realized why. Generally, I prefer to set things in like cascading gain stages where you have the lower gain stuff or cleaner stuff at the beginning. You know, maybe we'll have a really high level boost or something like that, but I want the dirt to get progressively higher, you know, the further we go. So if, again, going back to that example, if I had a clean level boost, start there, then I'd go into, say, a symmetrical clipping diode pedal, and then I'd go into kind of a mid-gain dirt drive pedal, then maybe I'd go into my full-blow distortion pedal, then I'd go to an amplifier. That's kind of my outlook. But in here, we've got the higher gain thing first, and the reason that is because I kind of treat this Bluesbreaker side as that always-on thing I talked about earlier. And you can do that with either a clean amp, get some great results with that, but the first thing I want to show you is just using this as your preamp. And it's super mid-heavy, it's not going to work with everything, and if I had some more outboard gear, I would definitely tweak this, but for consistency, using the same cabinet sound for all these demos, I want you to hear what it sounds like. So what I'm going to do is plug the output of this pedal into the effects return of the Ceriatone gargoyle, going through 50 watts of EL34 power amp juiciness, and I'm going to let you hear what it sounds like completely clean, then engaging this to kind of make it sound like a, you know, again, those old JTM 45 channels, and then turning on the horse side for some dirt and overdrive. And of course you can turn that to taste, but this will kind of give you, I think, the best sound so far of what this pedal does on its own. My overall approach for this setting doesn't really change when using a full clean amplifier. You'll see a few things will be moved, you know, output level, gain, that kind of stuff, just to compensate for the differences in level and how I'm wanting to push the preamp tubes, and kind of compensating for the mid deficiency of these American style amps. But I think this is probably my overall favorite use case, because you got, say, a one channel clean amp. That can be your channel one, throw on the breaker, dial it into wherever you want, from edge of breakup to, you know, kind of a crunch sound. There's your channel two, throw on the clon, and you've got just full blown saturated distortion if you want, or back it off for a clean boost. And you can get some good sounds too after you disable this side, maybe a little between all of those different sounds. So this is my favorite, I think, and it has a tonal texture that you don't hear in just tube stuff or just transistor stuff. The marriage between the two here is, I think, definitely suitable, and it's one that I don't explore all that often. But if you're going after, like, you know, John Mayer tones or something in that ballpark, then it's a pretty good way of going about it. Now let's talk about the Blues Breaker through Centura setting. And again, I don't get along with this one nearly as well. There are definitely cool tones to be had, but just given my tonal palette, my ear, my playing style, I find the boosted Centura sound to be a little lacking compared to the boosted Blues Breaker sound. So it's going to completely depend, but there's definitely cool things you can do. So the first thing I found was using the breaker side is kind of that semi-clean boost I was talking about, and then using this as your dirt channel. So again, if we're going to talk like a 3-channel setup, you got channel 1 completely clean, you put the breaker on, you've got a driven clean boost sound of sorts, put a little dirt on there if you want, and then this kind of changes your amp tone more so. And it's really sensitive because of the output and the cascading gain structure and everything. I'll just let you hear it. But it's a very, very different sound than here to here. The other really interesting configuration I stumbled upon was using the horse side as a semi-EQ clean boost thing, but in post. Again, I'm not a huge fan of this in front of a high gain amp with strictly, full output, no gain, that kind of thing. But using this in the same way that a lot of people like to modify their, say, lower gain, mid gain drive pedals works really well. So let's say you got a pedal that you really like the sound of, but you need some more output, and maybe there's a mid frequency or a bass frequency that's just pissing you off for a particular amplifier. Well, never fear, just grab a graphic EQ pedal, crank up the level, maybe dial up the frequencies you like, cut the ones you don't, and ta-da, you have kind of a new pedal sound, as it turns out, or at the very least, more of what makes that pedal sound good. And it's a very different phenomenon than taking that pedal and putting it in front of it, boosting a drive pedal with EQ. It kind of changes the guitar response and then in turn makes a different sound. So it's a completely different methodology, but this is one I actually like because we can dial up the breaker to be, again, kind of a semi-plexi thing, and then just add more gain, hit the preamp tubes harder for whatever we're using, and it's kind of nice. And then this will double as like a solo boost if you wanted to. Again, this is by no means the definitive catalog of things you can do in this configuration, but these are the ones that stood out to me. So as we approach the end of this video, what I will say is this is another special piece of gear in the sense that it makes me play so drastically different than I'm used to. It makes me want to grab more stuff like this and put together a crazy pedal board and grab a different guitar than I ever would and see what happens. There's a lot of country, rockabilly, hard rock, even prog tones in this little machine, especially depending on whatever you pair it with. And for that, I really, really dig it. It's not up in my usual alley of high gain amps and amp modelers, and that's what I really like about it. With that said, can I recommend it to everyone? Hell no. And it's a double-edged sword where Ceriatone makes such good amplifiers, especially the Hot Rod Plexi series, where there's only a few amps they make where I really think this would not be redundant. I'm just going to stick like a clean boost or a super overdrive in front of my gargoyle. It does everything I want it to, more or less. Now, get it to do everything switchably? No. And that's where maybe something like this could happen and make sense if you had a single channel amp platform where you have a completely clean, like Sovtech MIG or again, like a Fender Blues Deluxe setup or Bassman perhaps. Then a pedal like this with other gain pedals, drive pedals, that kind of stuff. Absolutely. I can see where that would be right up your alley. And if you're looking at the Centura, you know, for around the same price, you've doubled your value, if not exponentially more, because, you know, not only do you have two pedals, you've got two different variations of two pedals, plus a buffer. So yeah, very impressed. Again, I definitely cannot demo this to its full potential, but this is a keeper. And very, very grateful they sent this over once again. And I hope this will make another appearance later on with something that I can call a more permanent home. But yeah, I want to make music with it. That's really, at the end of the day, my conclusion. And I think that's about as high praise as I can give to anything, even if I simply can't tell you all to go out and buy it. But the value's there for what it is. So hopefully that was helpful. As always, please leave your questions and comments down below. And hopefully if I don't know the answer, I can find someone that does. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.